Right now, today, April 10th, a U.S. Air Force VIP aircraft has just landed in Islamabad, Pakistan. On board, the Vice President of the United States. And what happens in the next 48 hours inside that city could reshape the entire Middle East, or blow up the most fragile ceasefire in decades. This is not a diplomatic routine. This is not a scheduled summit. This is a last-minute, high-stakes negotiation between two countries that were actively bombing each other just days ago. J.D. Vance, the man Trump sent to do the hardest job of this war, is sitting across the table from Iranian officials for the first time since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Let that land for a second. The highest level direct contact between Washington and Tehran in over 45 years. And it's happening right now, today, in Pakistan. Nobody fully predicted this sequence of events. 6 weeks ago, U.S. and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. The region exploded. Iran sealed the Strait of Hormuz. Oil hit $119 a barrel, and the world held its breath, wondering if this was the start of something no one could stop. Then Pakistan picked up the phone. PM Shahbaz Sharif personally invited both delegations to Islamabad for April 10th, today, and both sides said yes. If this analysis is giving you context your newsfeed isn't, drop a comment below and tell us what you think happens next. And subscribe, because this story has many more layers to go. So why Vance? Why Pakistan? And why does the fragile 2-week ceasefire already look like it's cracking before talks even begin? Let's break it down layer by layer. Here's the first thing you need to understand about why this moment is so unusual. Trump originally wasn't even sure Vance would go. Just 2 days ago, on Wednesday, Trump told the New York Post there was a question of safety, security, around sending his VP into a city hosting Iranian officials. For a brief moment, it seemed like Witkoff and Kushner might go alone. Then the calculus shifted, and Vance boarded the plane. The decision to send the vice president, not just an envoy, signals something important about how Washington views these talks. This isn't a technical level negotiation over ceasefire mechanics. According to analysts tracking the delegations, the discussions are expected to extend well beyond a military pause, potentially touching on Hormuz maritime security and Iran's nuclear program. That's not a ceasefire negotiation. That's a potential restructuring of the entire U.S.-Iran relationship. And Iran reportedly asked for Vance specifically. According to Al Jazeera and regional sources, Tehran views Vance as more sympathetic to ending the conflict than other U.S. officials. His record matters here. As a senator, Vance was a vocal critic of interventionist foreign policy. He argued against new wars. He was skeptical of the military establishment's appetite for open-ended conflicts in the Middle East. Iran's calculus seems to be, if anyone in Trump's circle wants a real deal over a prolonged war, it's the man who built his reputation on avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because even as Vance flew toward Islamabad, the ceasefire he's supposed to be finalizing was already under serious strain. Israel never agreed that Lebanon was included in the truce. Netanyahu said so publicly. Trump echoed him. And then Israeli airstrikes hit Lebanon, hard. 254 people killed in a single day, Lebanese authorities reported. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi went on X and posted what amounted to an ultimatum. The U.S. must choose, ceasefire or continued war via Israel. It cannot have both. Iranian Parliament Speaker Kalibaf, who is leading Tehran's delegation in Islamabad, said that 3 out of 10 clauses of the ceasefire framework had already been violated before talks even started, and yet both delegations are in Islamabad. That tells you something critical about the state of this conflict. Both sides want an exit. Neither side can afford not to show up. Iran has taken massive damage. Its supreme leader is dead. Its air defenses have been degraded by weeks of strikes. Its economy, already crippled by sanctions, now absorbs the additional blow of a war that shredded its regional influence. The United States achieved its stated military objectives, at least according to Vance himself, who said in Budapest on Wednesday that the war would shortly conclude. But achieving military objectives and achieving a political settlement are two very different things. That gap between what bombs accomplished and what diplomacy must now deliver is exactly what the next 48 hours are about. What this suggests is that both sides arrived not because they trust each other, but because the alternative is worse. In geopolitics, that's often the only foundation a real deal ever gets built on. Here is the thing about Pakistan that almost nobody in the Western press is talking about. 6 weeks ago, this country was barely on the map of this conflict. Today, it is the room where the war ends, or doesn't. And that did not happen by accident. Pakistan has a population of roughly 254 million people and has been managing serious internal pressures, economic strain, political instability, and an active conflict with the Afghan Taliban on its western border. On paper, it was not an obvious mediator candidate, but it had something none of the larger powers had: access to both sides at the same time, with enough credibility to be taken seriously by each. It happened because of one man who spent months quietly building a channel that nobody else had. Field Marshal Asim Munir, Pakistan's army chief, and by most accounts, the most powerful figure in the country, was up through the night in the days before the ceasefire, personally working the phones. According to Reuters and multiple regional sources, Munir held direct calls with Vance, with Witkoff, and with Iranian Foreign Minister Arakchi, sometimes in the same night. He wasn't passing messages, he was shaping them. Pakistan transmitted the U.S. 15-point framework to Tehran. It received Iran's counterproposals. It helped redraft language that both sides could accept without publicly surrendering. The Financial Times reported that Washington effectively pushed Pakistan into this role, not because Islamabad volunteered, but because the U.S. needed a channel that Tehran would actually trust. And trust is the operative word here. Iran would not talk directly to Washington. Washington would not publicly soften its position. Someone had to stand in the middle and hold both ends together. Pakistan could do that for a very specific set of reasons. It shares a 909-kilometer land border with Iran. It hosts the world's second-largest Shia Muslim population. It does not base American troops on its soil, which meant Iran had no reason to target it during the conflict. During the war, Iran quietly allowed tankers flying the Pakistani flag to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Trump himself called this a gift. That small gesture was a signal. Islamabad was being preserved as a channel even during active hostilities. And crucially, Munir had already built a direct line to Trump. That relationship began in earnest in May 2025, when a brief military clash between Pakistan and India ended with Trump publicly claiming credit for the ceasefire. Pakistan backed that version of events. It was a small diplomatic gift that opened something much larger. When the Iran crisis exploded, Trump knew Munir's number. When Iran needed a back channel, Islamabad was already there. According to Al Jazeera's reporting on how the ceasefire came together, China also played a significant role behind the scenes. A senior official told the outlet that Beijing helped guarantee U.S. compliance and supported smooth talks in Islamabad. Trump later acknowledged China's involvement publicly. What this suggests is that the architecture of these negotiations is far more multilateral than it looks from the outside. You have the U.S. and Iran as the primary parties. You have Pakistan as the physical and diplomatic venue. You have China applying quiet pressure on Tehran's side. You have Egypt and Turkey rounding out the regional framework. And somewhere in that web, Vance has to find a deal. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated. Hours before the ceasefire was announced, Pakistan's own PM Sharif warned his cabinet, not for the cameras, but in an internal meeting. We must prepare for the consequences of war. The chances for peace are minimal. That is the man who brokered the deal speaking to his own ministers. Not confidence, resignation mixed with urgency. And as of April 9th, the day before Vance's plane landed, the Strait of Hormuz was still showing no signs of reopening. Ship tracking data confirmed vessels were still being blocked. The ceasefire was less than 48 hours old, and already it was fraying at every edge. That is the environment Vance walked into today. Not a clean diplomatic opening. A controlled burn, where everyone is hoping the wind doesn't shift. Let's talk about what is actually on the table in that hotel in Islamabad. Because the gap between the two sides right now is not a minor technical disagreement. It is structural. Iran walked in with a 10-point proposal. The U.S. walked in with a 15-point framework. And on the single most important question, Iran's nuclear program, the two positions are not just different. They are, at least publicly, completely incompatible. Iran's publicly released 10-point plan includes, explicitly, the acceptance of its right to enrich uranium domestically. It also calls for the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the Middle East, full lifting of all sanctions, reparations for war damages, and Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration's response to Iran's initial version was, in the words of White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, that it was literally thrown in the garbage. Trump himself said on Truth Social, "There will be no enrichment of uranium." Secretary of State Rubio confirmed the U.S. 15-point plan makes clear Iran can never have nuclear weapons. Defense Secretary Hegseth was even more direct. He said the enriched uranium will be removed, voluntarily or otherwise. So how are these two delegations even sitting in the same room? Because there appear to be two versions of Iran's proposal. Leavitt confirmed that Iran's initial 10-point plan was scrapped. Iran then put forward what she called a more reasonable and entirely different and condensed plan, the one that Trump described as a workable basis for negotiations. but Iran's public statement still referenced the original demands. The Persian version of the proposal differs from the English one on the enrichment question, a discrepancy Al Jazeera flagged, and that Vance himself dismissed, saying that public version came from a random Yahoo in Iran submitting it to public TV. What this suggests is that there may be a gap between what Iran is saying in public and what it has privately indicated through Pakistani intermediaries. Levitt said as much directly. In her words, what Tehran claims publicly is very different from what they say privately. She added that the US had received indications Iran would hand over its enriched uranium stockpile. If that is true, and it is a significant if, then the shape of a deal starts to become at least theoretically visible. Iran gives up domestic enrichment and transfers its stockpile. The US provides significant sanctions relief and economic normalization. Some formula is found for Hormuz that preserves Iranian face without giving Tehran a permanent chokehold on global oil. And Lebanon gets papered over with language ambiguous enough that both Netanyahu and Tehran can claim they didn't lose. But analysts are deeply cautious. Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute told Time, "I think people may be surprised by what Trump is willing to accept to get out of the war." He suggested Trump might accept some Omani-Iranian toll arrangement on Hormuz as long as the strait stays open. Alex Vatanka of the Middle East Institute warned that many of Iran's remaining demands, reparations, full US military withdrawal, are, in his assessment, wishful thinking. The nuclear question alone has derailed years of prior diplomacy. Go back to 2025. Multiple rounds of indirect talks in Muscat, Oman produced no agreement. Iran accelerated loading tankers with crude in anticipation of sanctions tightening. The US reinforced its military presence in the Gulf. Iran's Security Commission warned it would drag regional countries into conflict. And then, on February 28, 2026, the strikes began. The point is that the negotiating gap on nuclear issues is not new. It has been the core obstacle for years. What is new is the context surrounding it. Iran's infrastructure has been damaged. Its supreme leader is dead. Its economy, already under pressure from years of sanctions, has absorbed an additional shock. That changes the leverage. It does not necessarily change the new positions, at least not publicly. But leverage and position are two different things. In my view, the most honest reading of where things stand is this. Both sides have enough political cover to sit down, but neither side has enough domestic space to fully give ground on the issues that matter most. Which means the most likely immediate outcome is not a final deal. It is an extension, another 45 days, another round. And the question becomes whether the ceasefire can hold long enough for the real negotiation to take place, or whether one more Israeli strike in Lebanon, one more Iranian threat to close Hormuz, breaks the room before talks even find their footing. Because there is a third party in this that has no seat at the table in Islamabad and no obligation to honor anything agreed there: Israel. Netanyahu made clear Lebanon is not part of this ceasefire. Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon and Beirut continued even as Vance was boarding his plane. Iran's delegation flagged those strikes as ceasefire violations before the first session even started. And that structural problem, a deal being negotiated between Washington and Tehran while a third party continues military operations that Tehran holds Washington responsible for, is not a problem that Vance can solve in a hotel room in Pakistan. That is the fault line running underneath every conversation happening in Islamabad right now. So what does this all actually mean? And what comes next? Let's step back from the moment and look at the larger picture. Because what is happening in Islamabad today is not just about a ceasefire. It is about what kind of Middle East emerges from the wreckage of the last 6 weeks. The war that began on February 28th, with US and Israeli strikes that killed Khamenei and dozens of senior Iranian officials, changed the regional order in ways that cannot be fully undone by any deal signed in a Pakistani hotel. Iran's supreme leader is dead. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, has stepped into that role. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been strengthened internally by the conflict, even as Iran's conventional military was significantly degraded by strikes. The Strait of Hormuz, which carries roughly 20% of the world's oil and LNG every year, some $600 billion in annual trade according to BBC estimates, has been used as a weapon in ways that no one will forget. Every energy importer in Asia is now redesigning their contingency planning around the possibility that this waterway could be closed again. That is not a temporary shock. That is a permanent recalibration of how the global energy system assesses risk. And here's what makes Vance's presence in Islamabad historically significant, regardless of what the talks produce. This is the highest level direct contact between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Over 45 years of near total diplomatic silence, broken in a hotel conference room, in a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map 6 months ago. Even if these talks produce nothing more than an agreement to keep talking, that itself is a structural change. Because the framework that is being built, Pakistan as a recognized mediator, China as a quiet guarantor, a phased negotiation process with a defined timeline, is a diplomatic architecture that did not exist before this war. And once architecture exists, it tends to persist. Think about what this moment represents in terms of the actors involved. Pakistan, a country managing its own internal pressures and economic difficulties, just executed one of the most complex diplomatic operations in recent memory, and did it credibly enough that both Washington and Tehran publicly credited it. That changes Pakistan's position in every future conversation about Middle East stability. China acknowledged its role in moving Iran toward talks. Trump confirmed that on the record. Beijing just demonstrated that it can function as a backstop guarantor in a US-Iran negotiation, which is a capability no one had formally established before. And Vance, a vice president who built his career on skepticism of foreign military interventions, is now the face of America's most consequential diplomatic engagement in a generation. In my view, what this suggests about the deeper structure of the Trump administration's foreign policy is important to understand. The military phase of this confrontation with Iran was intense, targeted, and relatively short. It achieved specific objectives: Khamenei's removal, degradation of Iran's air defense network, pressure on Hormuz. Then it stopped. What followed was not prolonged occupation or escalation. It was an immediate pivot to negotiation through intermediaries. Whether that pivot produces a lasting deal or not, the pattern itself tells you something about how this administration thinks about the use of force, as a pressure instrument, not an end state. The question the next several weeks will answer is whether Iran's internal politics can produce the kind of concessions, on nuclear enrichment above all, that Washington needs to call this a political success at home. Because Trump needs a win he can name, a deal he can point to. Not, we stopped bombing, but Iran gave up its nuclear program and we reopened Hormuz. That is the political return he needs to justify the costs of this war, to Congress, to the markets, and to the American public. Iran needs something too. Its new leadership needs to demonstrate to its own population that the country came out of this with something real: sanctions relief, economic breathing room, and enough diplomatic language around enrichment that it doesn't look like total capitulation. Whether those two needs can be reconciled in 15 days, or 45, or however long this process extends, is the genuine open question that no analyst, no government, and no mediator can honestly answer right now. And here is one more layer that is worth naming. The markets are watching this in real time. When the ceasefire was announced, oil prices fell sharply, stock markets rallied. The Strait of Hormuz reopening, even temporarily, removed one of the most acute near-term risks to global growth. That market reaction tells you something about how high the stakes actually are. If talks collapse and the strait closes again, everything that moved on ceasefire news moves back, and probably further. The economic pressure that broke through 6 weeks of bombing starts building again, on every government in Asia that depends on that waterway for its energy supply. That is not an abstraction. That is a live risk sitting inside the conversations happening in Islamabad right now. What we can say is this: the fact that Vance is in Islamabad, that Arachi and Ghalibaf are in the same building, that Pakistan's phones are still open, and China is still engaged, means the window has not yet closed. And in a conflict this volatile, a window that stays open even a few days longer than it should have is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. The next 48 hours will tell us more about the future of the Middle East than the last several years combined. Watch this story carefully, because the deal that gets made, or doesn't, in that hotel in Islamabad will reshape energy markets, nuclear policy, and the regional order for decades. If this breakdown gave you perspective you weren't getting from your regular news feed, share it. Someone in your circle needs to understand what is actually being negotiated right now. Subscribe so you catch our next deep dive the moment it drops. And drop a comment. Do you think a deal gets done in 2 weeks? Because we want to know what you think.